All right, let me get us started. Welcome on behalf of the Canadian Society for the Study of Practical Ethics to our second webinar of 2022, Deconstructing Euro-centric Methods of Applied Ethics. I'm Craig Aguil. I'll be your host today. The Canadian Society for the Study of Practical Ethics is committed to the study of all the major areas of practical ethics: bioethics, business ethics, environmental ethics, ethics of technology, and so on, as well as to addressing ethical issues and concerns which arise in the humanities, social sciences, professions, and other areas of activity and learning. We have mounted many interdisciplinary conferences and events with other societies, groups, and institutions, and we're happy now to be presenting a webinar series and to have our three presenters today. We'll have two talks today. The first talk by Dr. Anna Gotlib, an associate professor of philosophy at Brooklyn College, is Trauma Out Loud, Bioethics as Public Philosophy. Our second talk has two presenters, Dr. Letitia Meynell, a professor of philosophy as well as of gender and women's studies at Dalhousie University, and Clarisse Paron, a graduate student in philosophy also at Dalhousie University. And their talk will be, is entitled, "Do we teach white supremacy in our applied ethics courses? And a proposal for what to do about it if we do." Each speaker will have 40 minutes to present, and then we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A. During the talks themselves, the audience, everyone except the speaker will be video and sound off. But we will invite you to unmute and ask questions during the Q&A. To ask a question, you may use the Zoom raise hand feature, and then we'll have you unmute to ask your questions. I'll also try to watch the chat for questions. And so if you ask a question there, I'll try to bring attention to. I hope that each of you gets a chance to visit our organization website, csspe.ca. You can find information about future events there, as well as our journal, the Open Access Canadian Journal of Practical Philosophy. And so now, for our first talk, let's welcome Dr. Gotlib.
Thank you. Thank you. And let me share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, and hear me? Yes? Okay, I'm going to assume that's a yes. Can someone give me a thumbs up? Okay, excellent, great. All right, so this is beginning stages of a project that I've been cobbling together for a while, and that hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about. I'm a medical ethicist, and I also work in moral psychology. And so I've been writing a lot, especially in the last 2 years, about trauma, all kinds of trauma, pandemic trauma, obviously being very central. And I started thinking about how bioethics, medical ethics as a discipline deals with trauma in ways that are non-clinical. And what I'm really beginning to sort of the conclusion that I'm trying to come to is that bioethics ought to kind of go along with what philosophy has been doing in general, which is a movement towards public philosophy, a way to try and engage the general public, especially when we're talking about things as pertinent to everybody's life as the pandemic and trauma. And so it is, in fact, trauma out loud, meaning not talking just to ourselves. All right. So in the beginning, I'm going to make 3 claims, and I'm not going to defend this. I'm just going to make these claims that bioethics can offer publicly accessible, jargon-free narratives. I know it can because I've seen it done. Although whenever I see it, I'm pleasantly surprised. Bioethics professionals can also create participatory spaces that give voice to trauma, and especially give voice to the traumatized. And I'll talk about that later. These acts of public outreach will require 3 things, at least 3 things. Openness to our own pain. We're not just the oracle. We are also experiencing this as we're talking about it. Fewer worries about professional respectability, which is something that I find beyond annoying, and more attention to intelligibility. So I think, communication is not just about what is said, it is about what is understood. And I think, we have to keep an eye on all three of these things. So this is and I say kind of a map of this talk because I tend to tell stories when I talk. And so this is more to sort of keep me in line, but roughly I'm going to talk about the several traumas of this pandemic, because trauma is not a single thing. The special traumas of vulnerability, very particular kinds of vulnerability. Then I'm going to talk about how not to talk about a pandemic, and then consider how to talk about a pandemic by considering public bioethics as a particular kind of narrative that I think can be effective in encouraging more inclusive and honestly more flourishing public spaces where the most important questions of the day can productively be discussed. Okay, so let's get a little depressed first. Where we wanted to be earlier in the beginning of this pandemic, at this point, we wanted over 70% global vaccination, hasn't happened. We wanted universal access to COVID vaccines, that hasn't really happened yet. We wanted more trust in biomedicine, and we were hoping for trust and expertise. And I've heard medical professionals and bioethics professionals, even 2 years ago, say, well, if there's any bright side to this pandemic is maybe for now, at least for once, we can center science and we can center expertise, and people can once again look to experts for answers. But really what we have, where we are, is right now we have 474 million cases of COVID in the world, 6.1 million deaths, and only about 50% of the population fully vaccinated. And as far as expertise and trust in science, in many polls have shown that this actually has gone down, right? And so what happened instead was the politicization of science and the confusion between things like medical care, individual medical care, and public health. Now, I live in the United States, where I think this is especially bad, where people really confuse this idea of the common good that public health is predicated on, and say, well, it's my body, I do or don't do whatever I want. Not understanding that getting something like a vaccine or wearing a mask is different from deciding whether or not one wants to get a physical or one wants to get a particular kind of operation. That one decision affects others in a way that the other doesn't. And so in a sense, we sort of have the opposite of what we wanted. And have we learned anything in these 2 years? Yes, but I think we've also learned that we don't cohere, we don't get together around important ideas and events quite in the way that we hoped we would. And so we get to the many traumas of the pandemic. Now, the pandemic is not in the rearview mirror. And I've heard a number of experts say, well, maybe we're getting close to the endemic stage. Maybe we're out of the woods. I myself am not convinced. There's the BA2, Omicron part 2, that's already been making its face known in Europe and China and elsewhere. So in a sense, the trauma of the pandemic are ongoing. So it's not in the rearview mirror. It is still happening. There's still, at least in the US, about 1,200 people dying a day from COVID. So that means what? That means we have to engage with the worst as it happens. That means we don't get to sort of sit in our armchairs thinking about it in the past tense, right? There's not much time for armchair reflection. We have to think about it and talk about it as it happens. So that means that philosophers are not safe from what they're conceptualizing. So a lot of political philosophers talk about wars in the global south. They talk about, conflicts that happened before, conflicts that are somewhere else. A lot of bioethicists talk about, cholera epidemics, the Ebola epidemics, things that happen somewhere else at some other time. And they can talk about it in a sense while feeling safe. Well, this is no longer the case. This is our pandemic. It's here, we're in it, and we have to experience it and conceptualize it at the same time, which I think is very challenging. And, I often find it challenging as well. So bioethicists especially are also witnessing diminishing returns, diminishing public trust in expertise. A number of bioethics conferences that I've been to recently, I hear the same thing. I hear, well, people don't just assume that experts know what they're talking about, especially when it comes to medicine. Either they are prone to believe conspiracy theories, the QAnon kind of stuff, or they see that medicine and medical experts have changed their minds, masks, no masks, vaccines, maybe boosters, maybe more boosters. And, there's a lack of understanding of how science works, in the sense that it doesn't give one final answer most of the time. And with bioethics, that's especially the case, because bioethicists are often seen as like the soft knowledge handmaidens of science. And, if scientists are not to be trusted, then bioethicists, well, what do they know? And thus we have a kind of a lack of certainty as a result about how to proceed. Now, there's a much more sort of direct way to talk about this trauma that we're all feeling. There's isolation, anxiety, and fear. Specifically, none of this is new. This is review. Physical isolation, social isolation, psychological, and obviously global anxiety. The pandemic world becomes phenomenologically strange and epistemically uncertain. There's no sense of safety or sense of life's relative predictability, and there's no narrative logic. There's a strange new placelessness that unmakes our world, leaving us with a kind of what I'm calling a world loss. And by world loss, I don't just mean a loss of certain cultural practices or relationships or economic livelihoods. They're important. What I mean is a loss of a sense of what to do next. The loss of envisioning a life that is not merely narratively coherent, but relatively practically and structurally sound. And there's a break in a connection with our past, present, and future. Ami Harbin wasn't talking about the pandemic, but she did, in her wonderful book, talked about something that she called disorientation. And I think that it really makes sense for us now. We are disoriented. We're disoriented in our own world because our own sense of ourselves and how we fit in our life stories don't make sense in the way that they used to. Now, I suggest that this is more so for us, and us, I mean us in the global north, who are relatively privileged. I think we're experiencing a kind of existential trauma. And it seems new for us because we are the lucky few, right? We seem particularly shocked by the external and internal damage of this era. It feels different to us, right? But this pandemic is truly global, right? It has direct and unprecedented effect on otherwise privileged global north, where we can't retreat to the relative stability of remote observation of disaster, right? Because most of these things have been over there or back then. More disadvantaged people have experienced pandemics, endemics before. But for us, we are traumatized because we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, this is happening to us right now. And when I was writing about this stuff, I saw a lot of people really saying, one of the worst parts of this is disbelief. I can't believe that we're living through this global pandemic. Whereas, people who are not as privileged say, well, that is because you're not aware of other pandemics, of other disasters that happened elsewhere and sometimes right around the corner. So I think a part of the trauma of the global north has everything to do with our privilege. It also has to do with slightly insufficient imagination. And I know this is a controversial claim for some. I've gotten some pushback, but okay, hear me out. I think our trauma doesn't follow our usual literally and popular cultural memes or master narratives about how the apocalypse might unfold, right? So most of the time, we are thinking that we are battling zombies, that we are heroic, that we are at the end of the world trying to save the last remaining people, that we're doing something active. We're basically protagonists, right? We're trying to find ingenious ways to survive an unsurvivable universe. But really what happened in March of 2020 is that we went to our rooms and closed the door and felt really, really helpless. And those of us who were privileged enough to have things delivered, not have to go out, not be an essential worker, that was our experience of the pandemic for a long time. And I think in a sense, our creative imagination, whether through movies or books, did not prepare us for this kind of isolation and anxiety, right? We're not heroes and we're not even the protagonists. Maybe we're like that, third character who gets named once and is not really important. And so we started to look backwards. And I said, our stories about what we've lost often begin with in the before times. So rather than sort of looking forward and trying to figure out what to do, we're trapped in this uncertain, uncomfortable, unheroic present. And we're looking backwards. Sort of, there's this kind of a nostalgia, right? I mean, how many times have I heard friends say, oh, I really miss the time that I could just get on the subway and not worry about who's going to be wearing a mask, or go to a restaurant and, not look around to see how closely people are sitting together. So that's the kind of thing that we are missing. But by we, and that's a very kind of narrow term, I think that we have to expand the notion of the we, and not just to populations in the global South, but I really think that vulnerable populations, and by that I mean people who are immunosuppressed, immunocompromised, disabled, elderly, they are affected by this, not just because it is a horrible pandemic that's dangerous to everyone, but because it is especially dangerous to them now, when the rest of the world seems to be, well, I'm going to put it not very politely, really, really friggin' tired of the mask mandate, right? You hear this, I'm tired, I'm over the pandemic. And I have a very good friend who's actually a bioethicist, and she's immunocompromised. She's and she said, this isn't over for me. And because my neighbor thinks it's over, and because my neighbor can take off his mask and not worry about it, that means I have to hide even more. So she says, what do I do? Do I go out there and pretend that, yes, things are great? Or do I lock the door even tighter? Because now I have to worry not just about people who are masked, but people who are unmasked. And there are millions of people who are immunocompromised and immunosuppressed with high risk of infections. They're less able to participate socially and professionally. But the pandemic paradoxically facilitated their engagement, right? Think about it. Everything went online. And a lot of people who were immunosuppressed, immunocompromised for the last 2 years have been able to participate in a social life in a way that they haven't before, because everything was online. And now when everything is going again in person, and the sort of mantra of normalcy or going back to normal is dominating, they feel even more threatened and even more afraid. The message is, and this is the message, I sort of wrote it down as it was told to me by my friend. She said, be left behind or reintegrate. So either reintegrate and sort of put yourself at risk, or be left behind and basically don't participate. So I'm beginning with this slide, beginning to suggest that medical humanities and bioethics and philosophers have to respond publicly with critiques of this new normal in ways that center these vulnerable others, not have them be, oh, also, by the way, center them, start out. This is impacting people, millions of people who don't have the kind of immune system that you have. They don't have it. That's not the way their life is. So encouraging a kind of empathy through shared stories might be one way to do it. I'm a narrativist. I really approach ethics from a narrative perspective. And so even when I teach, I find that sometimes telling my students a story is much more effective than having them read, a philosophical article I have them do both, but sometimes I feel like they get it a lot more when I actually tell a story. Also, I think bioethicists, other than, telling stories and creating empathy, should connect with people's self-interested concerns and clarify the connections between viral evolution within those that are less protected and the resulting threat to general public health. Viruses evolve. How did they evolve? They evolve a lot more in people who are not as immune, who are immunosuppressed. So in a sense, if these people are not protected, the rest of us could suffer from Omicron part 4. So this notion of normalcy is harmful, obviously, to the vulnerable, the immunosuppressed, immunocompromised. It's also dangerous to the rest of society. Because if we sort of put our blinders on and we pretend that things are normal, in the end, I think it's going to come and bite back as a kind of a revenge effect. So now I want to talk about how not to talk about a pandemic, right? So these are the mistakes that I've seen made. So assumption of a biomedical authorities and lay people that being immunocompromised or disabled is already a lesser way of living. There's an assumption that, well, people who are immunocompromised are already staying home because, their lives are worse. So this isn't going to affect them that badly. They're just going to continue staying home. And the kind of question that some immunocompromised people get is, don't you isolate all the time anyway? So, how is this any different for you? Might as well just stay home. For March 2020, the public health message was, you, meaning you, the normal person, don't need to panic about COVID. Only elders and disabled people would die. And you still hear that sometimes, even a few months ago from the CDC in the United States, that really COVID is now the disease of the unvaccinated and the immunocompromised. Well, unvaccinated, that's one thing. Those are choices that people have made. I don't agree with those choices, but they can change that. If you're immunocompromised, you can't really change that. That's a problem. May 6, 2020, I just think this particular tweet is so indicative. A conservative stay-at-home mom, Bethany Mandel, said, "You can call me a grandma killer. I'm not sacrificing my home, food on the table, all of our docs and dentists, every form of pleasure, museums, zoos, restaurants, all my kids' teachers in order to make other people comfortable. If you want to stay locked down, do. I'm not." And you hear that now too. In the United States, teachers were getting a lot of pressure to unmask the children because people said, well, I don't really care what the consequences are. And so you do hear these back channel messages now. At work, school, vaccine and mask restrictions, they just lifted all mask restrictions at City University of New York, which is where I teach. And there's been quite a bit of concern from the faculty there because, well, we weren't consulted, but that's to be expected. But also, a large portion of the people who work at CUNY are not vaccinated, either for religious reasons, for other reasons. We have a large immigrant population that doesn't really trust expertise for a number of complicated reasons. And so we're a bunch of people, a bunch of us are vaccinated and a bunch of us aren't. And now all the masks are off. And that's really caused a lot of anxiety on campuses. Economy, because we do live in a neoliberal society, is usually given as a number one concern, right? For lifting all restrictions. Save the bars, sacrifice the teachers, sacrifice the immunocompromised. And they're worried about people's mental health, which I absolutely understand. Children's mental health, but not all people's. Go back to the people who are immunocompromised. What about their mental health? Which, by the way, is already, they're already suffering from a number of other oppressions, which I'm not going to get into. But this is a big extra thing, because the message they're hearing is stay home or sacrifice yourself. We don't care. That's not great for their mental health. And risk will not lessen at the same rate for everybody, right? On January 8th, 2022, so this is a lot closer to now, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director, Rochelle Walensky, made all these biases explicit. She was giving an interview on Good Morning America, and she said that she was really encouraged that, quote, only unwell people were dying of Omicron. And that, I just find that shocking and striking, and it set my hair on fire. It's one thing to say that it's, we should pay attention to the fact that unwell people are still dying of Omicron. But the way she said that she was really encouraged that only unwell people are dying of Omicron, I think is, it's disturbing to say the least. So how to make pandemic trauma worse then, right? So ignore the risk for elderly, sick, and disabled people to leave their home. And also, the creation of new public spaces by the able-bodied and the healthy that exclude large part of the population. And I think that bioethicists, philosophers in general, are too slow to challenge this. Because in a sense, a lot of us, find ourselves in the healthy and able-bodied category and say, yeah, I want the public spaces open. And only then, then think about the people who are at risk, think about them as sort of also think about that, but not central. And I think that what we should be doing is centering this. So we are sort of stuck with two situations, bad epistemologies and wrong priorities. So lay people, I think, have bad epistemologies. Not the result of necessarily socioeconomic status, education, or political alignments, although those have something to do with it. Bad epistemologies about the pandemic as a result of conspiratorial thinking, aversion towards restrictions of individual freedom, rejecting of responsibility for or even understanding of public health, fear of medical procedures, some religious beliefs, and of course, social media, right? I think social media feeds bad epistemologies, and it creates communities that literally screen out problematic or contrary evidence, right? So you have a bunch of lay people who don't really think about the pandemic as an issue of public health, and they especially don't think about those most vulnerable as most impacted by these particular kinds of epistemologies. We also have what I'm calling wrong priorities of actually bioethicists and philosophers. I like this quote: all the disciplines have become more and more specialized, more and more quantitative, making them less and less accessible to the general public. So in a sense, philosophers and bioethicists tend to talk to ourselves a lot and to people like us. And the priorities become convincing and engaging with these discourses that are closed off to the public that I just finished talking about. And they're bad epistemologies. We're not really addressing them, right? So academic culture becomes arcane unintelligibility while disdaining impact and audience. I'm sure, and if I'm wrong, please tell me, many people in this audience right here who engage with public philosophy, applied ethics, practical ethics, have been, had to defend what they do. I know I certainly have. I've actually had a very distinguished member of the profession once ask me, why is practical ethics even philosophy? Why isn't it just a kind of like weak sauce sociology or psychology? How is this even philosophical? So academic culture drives people like us who want to talk to the lay people away and say, well, you're not really one of us, right? So there's a culture of exclusivity. There's this disciplinary border patrolling, disdain of things that we do. And again, persistent myopia regarding vulnerable populations. I find it very disturbing. There's certainly people who work in disability theory. There are people who write about that, but they are kind of a minority. And people who do mainline philosophy, mainline bioethics very often just sort of ignore it. What's the result? We mostly talk to each other. Topics that rarely address the world, right? Or we address it in a kind of a coded language. We publish in obscure and expensive journals. And I just have to say, conferences that we go to, right, that don't address, address outsiders to a given discipline. This is a wonderful thing that this particular organization is doing. This is free. People can just sort of come. I've been to plenty of conferences where registration is $600. So I don't really see many outsiders even feeling invited because there's a $600 fee you have to pay just to attend. And again, there's worries about respectability. Is what I'm doing practical ethics, bioethics? Is that really philosophy? And thus marginalized voices remain marginalized. So I think this is sort of a toxic soup in which those of us who work in bioethics and other kinds of applied philosophy swim in. It's hard for us to talk to lay people. There's all these barriers. We're not very good at it. And within our own discipline, sometimes we're not taken seriously. So what do? Time to do something else. So public philosophy, it is a growing field. I'm very happy that it's a growing field. Personally, I've been trying to publish in non-professional journals as well as professional journals to kind of get philosophy out there. And those journals exist. They're not nearly as prestigious as the top 10 publications in your field, but I can tell you that just numbers wise, I've had 10 times more number of people reading the things that I've published in Aeon, for example, Aeon Psyche, than have ever read anything that I've published in a peer-reviewed journal. But the questions remain. Is it taken seriously by philosophers? Is it reaching non-philosophers? That's a big one. And are younger scholars encouraged to explore it as a career option? I mean, I remember being in graduate school, and I was fortunate to be in a department at Michigan State University where public philosophy was taken seriously early on as far as bioethics. But I remember being at conferences as a grad student, and I've had people say, well, doesn't your advisor care about you? You're doing bioethics, you're doing medical ethics, applied philosophy. I mean, do you plan on getting a job? Good news is that I did, but that was pretty much kind of the ongoing narrative. So what do? Aside from something else? Well, one possibility is we'll become what's known as public intellectuals. I really don't like the slightly elitist tone that has, but here's one definition. Intellectuals help societies talk about their problems. They contribute to a democratic life when they civilize political contestation and when they subvert complete consensus, when they provide enemies with a discursive possibility to become opponents, and when they facilitate public deliberations about problems buried by the norms of civility. I think the most important sense for me there is intellectuals help society talk about their problems. And boy, do we have problems to talk about. So when I talk to graduate students who are thinking about this, I always ask them, I said, what is it that's really keeping you awake at night? You're writing a dissertation, you're publishing your papers, you're teaching, but what's on your mind that's really making you like want to scream sometimes? Maybe it's just me, I'm weird. And very often they say something, I'm like, well, that's actually a big social issue. That's a big social problem. Do you want to talk about that to a lot of people? And the answer is usually no. I mean, yes, the answer is usually yes. Okay. Now it's going to get weirder. I'm a big fan. I grew up with Pippi Longstocking, the book. I don't know if anybody did. And it came to me in this weird sort of, I don't know, eruption of the brain, that Pippi Longstocking really has a lot to say to us. Now, if you haven't read it, Pippi Longstocking is a protagonist in books by Astrid Lindgren. She's a very strange child. She lives alone with her monkey and horse, and basically tells the rest of society to, I'm not going to say it because it's being recorded, but to sort of, that she's going to do what she wants, right? She disorients and unsettles established and examined beliefs, assumptions, and values. She's very much a rebel. And so what I think is that bioethicists ought to reorient ourselves from being very polite in the way we talk about medicine and public health and vulnerability and power. And we sort of, we center the education of biomedical professionals. Maybe we should become less polite and more Pippi-like. And in Ami Harbin's word, we disorient biomedicine's professional cultural practices and values. We can challenge biomedicine's systemic injustices. We can question our own role as biomedicine's handmaiden. And again, back to the most vulnerable, we can reject the longstanding deflection of the voices of the most vulnerable. We talk back to the ongoing pandemic public health narrative, like that of the CDC director, who said, oh, thank God it's only the vulnerable that are dying. right? So we talk back because that kind of talk erases some of the most vulnerable people. And so we center the traumas of the most vulnerable out loud. Yeah, I finally got to the title, right? Out loud. We make it clear. We don't apologize. We don't say, oh, yes, they're also important. We say something like they're fundamentally important. I think this is a question to consider. If we speak, will anyone listen? Well, on one hand, sure, yes. Democracy demands informed deliberation and discourse, of which we are part. Official narrative number 2, education is universally important. So these are the kind of the official master narratives that would suggest that we would be successful, but there's an existing bias against experts. There's this approach to education as a kind of a means to employment, and at CUNY, this is pernicious. I constantly have to tell my students that we're not a job factory, we're an educational institution. There's a pernicious anti-intellectualism in the United States, but I'm pretty sure in Canada as well. And democracy as an online chat room, in the sense that everyone's opinions matter. Remember earlier I talked about the problematic epistemologies of lay people. This is where they come to fruition. Everybody has an opinion. Doesn't matter if somebody's an expert. I Googled for 10 minutes, you got a PhD. Our opinions are exactly the same. And while I think that's a democratizing move, I think it's also, in the end, a harmful move. Because if everything is leveled out and there's no distinction between somebody who's actually an expert, somebody who's actually spent a lot of time thinking about it, and somebody who just, Googled something, then I think the whole notion of expertise goes out the window. But I don't think it's bad just because, well, we don't get to feel good about ourselves as experts. I think as experts, we have something to offer. And this democracy as online chat room, I think diminishes us, not just to our own detriment, but to the detriment of the larger society. But this is another sort of comment that I get, that's just academic. And academic is a stand-in for not really important. But I still think we need public intellectuals, experts and scholars who stimulate and guide social discourse about what matters. In this society, to be a scholar is in many ways to be irrelevant. To be accepted as relevant by the general public, you better have a TED Talk. I've actually, after I've given a lecture, I had a student come up to me and said, oh, you should make that into a TED Talk, then people really listen to it. So it's like the TEDification of education or edutainment, right? And I think that by itself, it has a democratizing function, but at the same time, it's kind of destructive of what we do. And again, freedom of skepticism. The person who Googles for 10 minutes is as free to believe what they want to believe as somebody who has an MD or a PhD. So I think the expression that's academic is really indicative of the uphill battle we're going to have to fight if we're going to be successful public philosophers and public bioethicists and address these issues that I think really need addressing. So this is why we have to speak anyway. Higher education in North America, and notice I'm not saying the US, North America and Europe as well, is increasingly instrumentalized. Again, education is job preparation, STEM. How many philosophy departments right now are afraid of becoming basically STEM handmaidens, right? So, what do the pre-meds need? Pre-meds need bioethics, we should teach bioethics. There are particular integration of the humanities and destroying the imagination, limiting the horizons of what is possible. So all of this is happening, including defunding, including technocratic private solutions to intellectual problems and public disengagement. Despite all of this, I think we need to speak. Craig, am I out of time? You appeared.
You have maybe 2 minutes left about.
Fantastic. I have 2 slides. So despite all of this, I think we have to find it in ourselves to become public intellectuals who may not necessarily be popular, who may not be liked. So what do? So Parsi and Garanti argued that public philosophers must create what they called the spaces of resistance. We have to create the spaces where the vulnerable are centered and where epistemologically bad discourses are challenged. And we might do this within higher education, with the general public, by not being ashamed of being who we are. And to distinguish ourselves from neoliberal thought leaders and TED Talk stars. And that's a whole different issue. So we must not only speak for the most vulnerable, we must center them in this kind of spaces of resistance. I'm going to skip the next slide. I'm going to give a particular shout out to feminist bioethicists as reluctant public intellectuals. I think feminist bioethicists are especially important to this task because a lot of our work is already in solidarity with the disadvantaged and the vulnerable. We have the importance of multiple perspectives that we're already working with, such as within care ethics. We address political dimensions of health in a way that it's very often not addressed by others. And we already assume gender, vulnerability, and disadvantage as central to discussions about health. We recognize that power relations constitute communities and their choices. And these are really, I think, lively and sort of valuable perspectives from which to engage with these issues. And finally, why we're reluctant? Well, again, because very often what we do is both professionally and personally threatening, right? We can be further marginalized, we can be doxxed, we can be gaslit, we can get death threats. All of these things have happened. So in trying to find solidarity and trying to center the vulnerable, again, this is another hill that we have to climb. Thank you.
Thank you for that talk. That was fantastic. For the Q&A, if you have a question under reaction, you can raise your hand and I will call on you. Otherwise, you can add a question into the chat. I think we've got one question I see right off the bat. Sandra, do you want to unmute and then ask your question? I think I'm trying to ask. There we go. Maybe.
I'm okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. I really like calling any kind of practical ethicist to action. But I'm wondering what kind of spaces philosophers can find themselves in with an audience. Although I think there is a whole lot that practical philosophers can contribute to thinking about a whole lot of issues that you have raised, where would you find the space that would have the people that they could engage with?
No, thank you. That's really great. So the annoying answer, sometimes we have to make the spaces because they're not there. I mean, obviously, we have the spaces of our own classrooms, right? And we have the spaces of publications that are aimed at the general public, but also we have spaces such as this one. We have spaces, some colleagues and I have been running a philosophy cafe we had to take it online, but in person, it was basically in a real cafe where there'd be a topic and people could come and just speak. And, we'd have something to say and then the audience would contribute. So we'd literally commandeer a space in a physical space or an online space and then welcome everybody. And sometimes it's messy. It's not as, well organized as a conference, but I think it gets people to think about things they haven't. Also, in Brooklyn, we have this thing called Brooklyn Public Philosophers, of which I am a part. What we do is we set up booths, just like a booth, like the kind that sells pies. We set up booths at public markets, in subways, in libraries, sometimes near shopping areas. And we have a bowl of questions that somebody can just reach in and ask, or people can ask their own questions. And we've had a really good response. People just come up. They usually don't expect 2 or 3 philosophers to sit there and say, hey, ask us anything for free. So that's been working really well. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Craig, I can't hear you.
Letitia, I believe you had your hand up next.
Yeah, so I've done a certain amount of public philosophy, and I agree with a lot of what you've said, but the thing that has always made me reluctant, particularly talking to media, which is one of the most effective ways to, do public philosophy, is do the radio shows, get your name in the paper, so on and so forth, is it's a high risk and zero reward, and often works at a time schedule that is not mine. So, you get the sort of, there's a reporter who is looking for someone because their schedules are so tight. They need someone to give them a comment. They're hoping to talk to you this afternoon. And it's an area you kind of sort of know. But even if it's an area you know really well, you have to be like, there's nearly always a specific hook that they have. And so you need to read or try to read the science article, which hasn't come out yet, because they're just responding to a press release. And so if you're teaching, you can't possibly, the whole schedule of it. And the only person I know who can do it successfully is Françoise Baylis, because she's kind of superhuman. And also she's quite narrow in terms, she works on particular things and she knows them really well. So yeah, I don't know. That's where I find public philosophy is a nut I can't crack. And I was wondering what you thought.
Yeah, I share your sort of worry about the whole press thing. I've had a personal experience with this last year. I was interviewed by 2 online sources and then the BBC regarding the low vaccine uptake in Russia. This is before the war in Ukraine. And, the way it works is they email you and can you be available for BBC in 3 hours? It's 11 p.m. And the negative part of that is I felt like, the sound bites they took from me were insufficient. Didn't really have time to prepare for it. But I did have feedback from, again, strangers, regarding, you said there and there. And so it did lead to some engagement with people who maybe just overheard it while they were sitting at home at night. I think it's unsatisfying in the sense that I think the press tends to simplify what we say for time and space. But I guess my thinking is that a little bit is better than nothing. And the more of us do this, the more of us become voices that are heard in places other than an academic institution or an academic conference. I think the better it is. I just think that we need to sort of spread the wealth. I mean, I love Art Kaplan, but he's everywhere, right? And so I'm thinking, why don't we have not just Art Kaplan, but a bunch of other people whose voices should be heard as well.
Jane, I invite you to ask your question next.
Sure. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed the talk. And I really enjoyed a lot of what you had to say about centering the vulnerable in the public philosophy we do. And that really struck me because it seems as though a number of the bioethicists who have the largest public profile do not necessarily center the vulnerable, and in fact are, a wee bit eugenicist at times, say. So I thought that was really interesting and valuable, but then it made me wonder a little bit about what's going to count as expertise and what looks like expertise. And I'm just wondering, kind of practically speaking, in terms of centering the vulnerable in a way that might recognize their own expertise as well. So I'm thinking, for example, of folks with chronic illnesses who have a great amount of expertise about their condition and probably have been forced to have even more expertise than than the average healthcare professional, but who don't necessarily have the same sort of platform as a public philosopher might, who has an academic position and might be able to get the media's ear, that sort of thing. So how can public philosophers really not just center the vulnerable in terms of their concerns, but also in terms of taking seriously some of their expertise and maybe, incorporating it or collaborating or other sorts of things. I hope that made sense, and I'd really love to hear your reflections on it.
Yeah, thanks. The first thing, this is off the hip, but the first thing that came to mind is, instead of bringing somebody with, like I've seen at some conferences, somebody who's immunocompromised, and saying, well, here, Mary, tell your story, and then I'm gonna give a bunch of, biomedical flourish to it. I'm gonna put it into, fancy terms. I think maybe set aside the fancy terms and let Mary tell her story, and then have people ask her directly, which is not an approach that I've seen done that much, because what it does is it actually centers Mary and not the bioethicist who is writing about Mary. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So in a sense, we have to kind of we have to get out of our own way, and we'll have to get out of the way of other people and let them talk. Because if we're serious about expertise, then can't be just our own, right? We have to recognize expertise in other people who've had a particular experience, and who have epistemologies of the kind that we only can write about, but not really live within. Does that answer it?
Yeah, it does. And maybe there's also like a side thing about like trying to really encourage those folks who have the lived experience and also the philosophy as
right.
Well, and through more. Yeah.
There are actually plenty of people in academia who have immunocompromised conditions, who have all sorts of vulnerabilities that they don't write about, or they feel like they would get in the way. So, yeah.
Thanks so much.
Great. I think next I'm seeing Alex, if you would like to ask your question.
All right, thank you very much. Wonderful talk, thank you. I really like the idea of trying to make a splash. I've presented here myself early last year, and I've tried to publish to the journal, working on the capacities approach to the material realities of aging. But I'm a PhD student in library science. I'm way out of the field. So I often find I lack the social capital to push back on things that I find disturbing. For example, I encountered a distinguished professor, saying something along the lines of, old people should die and be replaced by the next generation. And it's like, okay, I get that it will happen, but should happen? Like, is that really the position you want to take? And I can't push back on it, because when I've tried in the past, my attempts generally produce the opposite result. They're like, oh, well, if he's saying this, then obviously it's doubly dismissible. So maybe it's just because I don't have the credibility, or is there a space where I could, I would like to contribute to the project of making the world a better place.
Right. I so identify with what you said, because when I was a graduate student, I've gone to plenty of conferences where I thought what somebody was saying was, not just something I disagreed with, but like, wow, that is a really messed up way of looking at the world. Like, how can you even justify that? And for the longest time, I was like, well, who am I to say anything? I sat in the back, took some notes, and then, gossiped about it with friends. But it sort of, when I became sort of a more senior graduate student, I started speaking out, like literally speaking, like raising my hand at conferences and challenging things that seemed to me to be askew, and it wasn't comfortable. It was scary as hell. Like, I remember the first time at APA, American Philosophical Association, I raised my hand when a very senior faculty member was speaking, and I disagreed with him. I really thought I was going to pass out. Like, I was really scared. But after a while, it became more comfortable. And then you start writing, and you realize that when you write, it's okay to challenge people. It's, sometimes I wish that scholarly journals did what the magazine The Economist does. I don't know if you know, but The Economist doesn't publish bylines. So when you read something in The Economist, it's just an article and you don't know who wrote it, except with some exceptions. Sometimes I wish it was like that, right? But sometimes you have to act like it is. Alex, I'm sorry, I know this is really unsatisfying. What I'm telling you is basically stick your head in there where it doesn't feel comfortable and just open your mouth and say things.
I gotta say, I try it. The problem is, like, I've gotten to that point. I am at the senior stage of the PhD process. It's just because of how I'm viewed, anything that I try, any position I try to push, my attempt, because it's me that's trying to push it, automatically undermines it in the eyes of the people I'm trying to reach.
Because you think you're not the right specialty?
Because they think I'm not the right specialty, because they think that I have too many other things that I try to push for, because I'm associated with attempts to cross disciplinary boundaries. It's just,
well,
yeah.
I mean, look, I'd be more than happy to give you my email and we could talk about this in more detail. But, I come from a field, in medical ethics where we are interdisciplinary and we get crapped on all the time by more quote unquote respectable philosophers.
Yeah.
So I absolutely feel it. So yeah, if you want to, I'll send you my email here in chat. And
That'd be fantastic. Thank you.
We have just a few minutes left and I'm greedy. So I want to seize the, I guess, the chair's prerogative to turn this from bioethics just to literature. I was curious about the example of Pippi Longstocking. And I was thinking about Pippi as compared to, gosh, I can never remember his real first name, but Encyclopedia Brown. And I was thinking about what makes Pippi special and what makes Encyclopedia special. And what makes Pippi special seems to be, she's super strong. She lives she lifts horses or whatever she does. She, goes on adventures. She, her mom has passed away and her dad's a pirate captain or something like that.
Or so she says. Yeah.
You're right. But she's kind of living on her own. And she has adventures. She doesn't seem like someone who's sort of stewarding the public good, nor is she someone who's she doesn't have the kind of backing of a, say, Ph.D. or that. Whereas Encyclopedia, he's a capitalist. He charges 25 cents per mystery, but he's known for being very smart in a very adult way. He knows a lot of stuff. He's well studied. He solves the people's problems. He fights for the disadvantaged against bugs. And so I'm just curious if Pippi is particularly a great model for someone to say, like, look, those of us who are experts should be public intellectuals, or whether Pippi kind of calls for, like, I've got a PhD in philosophy. I should just be out there talking to, forget the public. The public's boring. I should go, have some adventures, dealing with my own pandemic trauma or talking to other. Yeah. So I just thought, which of these two characters is better suited for public intellectual and expertise?
That's a really, really good question. And I just want to preface this by saying that, like, using Pippi, that's just my own personal sort of childhood obsession. I'm like, oh, how can I use this? But actually, to be more serious, the way Pippi makes sense to me is I'm going to put Pippi and Ami Harbin together. And if anybody, like, I'll have to apologize to Ami. I'm not trying to say that her work is like that, but I think it makes sense when she talks about destabilization and when she talks about sort of unsettling our comfort zone, because I don't think Pippi speaks to expertise in the same way, but she does speak to a kind of a process of unsettling, of not necessarily accepting the traditional master narratives of whatever has come before just because it is old. It's the first act of saying no, things are not necessarily like that, right? So Pippi isn't the complete picture, but I think she's the first step. And the first step is the courage to push back. Like, she's kind of a walking counter narrative to the received wisdom of the ages. So does that make sense? Okay.
That's great. All right.
And there were a few questions that were typed. I'm sorry I didn't get to them.
We'll make sure to save the chat so that if if you'd like to get to those questions later, they'll be there.
Thank you.
But now I would ask us to thank our speaker. And we will now turn to our second talk of the day from Letitia Meynell and Clarisse Paron.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to ask Craig to give me a thumbs up to make sure he can hear me. Yes, great. So I assume everyone else can too. I'm sort of weirdly working from two screens, so I apologize for the fact that I will not be looking at you most of the time. I'll try and be better. So yeah, what Clarisse and I are going to talk about today is a project that we've been working on, this Applied Ethics Primer. I believe Clarisse just posted a link to the primer in the chat, so you're welcome to have a look at it and browse while we're talking about it. What I'm going to do today, if I can move my slides on, is I'll talk a bit about my long journey toward writing this primer, how I felt compelled to write it. Then Clarisse will give a bit of an overview of the primer and an overview of the ethical lens approach we take, and why we feel that's insufficient, why we go beyond it. Then we'll talk a bit about some advantages of the approach and what we're planning to do with the primer. So it's we have a good finished draft of the primer, but we feel like we need to do one more set of corrections. So we're really looking for input. And then I'll talk about a couple of objections to the whole project and replies to them. So just starting out, I started worrying about how to teach applied ethics when I started teaching applied ethics as a graduate student. And it became apparent to me that at least the way I teach applied ethics, theory is important. It really hit home to me when I was teaching business ethics, and the business students were very, very taken with the case study method. And they seemed to learn case studies in business ethics without learning any theory. And it ended up to me just seeming like they were practicing rationalization. And I think the usefulness of theory is that it really gives you something to stand on. It hooks your reasoning about moral problems into fundamental moral concerns or moral considerations. And, you know, it's not a mistake that we have all of these kinds of both primers for applied ethics, and then that a lot of textbooks will have either introductory chapters that have a bunch of theory or have theoretical overviews themselves. Here are some of those. But at least in my experience, from what I've been able to find, the theory in these books is nearly always very Euro-centric. So typically you get your Kantianism, your utilitarianism, your Aristotelianism, then maybe some feminism, maybe some pluralism, if you're lucky. Sometimes you'll have non-European issues in these textbooks, but they're often tokenized and merely in applications. Actual non-European philosophy, and by European, I really mean anything in the European tradition. So contemporary American philosophy would be, for these purposes, European as well. And obviously English would be European as well. Basically, again, I mean, what people often call Western philosophy, but Western always seems to me a ludicrous concept, beside the point. Anyway, yeah. So I was concerned by the total absence of non-European philosophy. Now, I first started getting struck about how there are certain philosophical similarities across global traditions when I went to a speech by the Dalai Lama at the Kalachakra in Toronto. And that was in 2004. That's how long ago. And the picture I have here is just an image from the Kalachakra. I'm not sure I could describe it, but it's very beautiful. And there I went to this sort of keynote address, in effect, at the Sky Dome by the Dalai Lama, where he's talking about the importance of ethics. And I was the annoying person sitting next to my partner going, oh, care ethics, oh, deontology, oh, utilitarianism, because, you know, the Dalai Lama just kept on touching on what were clearly the same kinds of issues that these theories would bring up. And then I was working, so many years later, I guess probably about a decade later, with Gordon McCuad, who's a historian and philosopher of science at King's, on his the Shirk-funded project, which was about engaging Indian particularly, but Asian generally, science, and reframing the view of the relationship between European and American and South and East Asian science as one of engagement rather than simply about a dominant colonial project stealing, in effect, knowledge, means, technology, and materials from East Asia. And then another thing that's got me really thinking about it is the move to diversity thinking away from difference thinking. This I could talk about more in the question period, but it's something that actually the feminist neuroendocrinologist Sari Van Anders talks about when she's talking about sexual differences. But I actually think it can be generalized, and often is in feminist thought, generalized much more. She just has a particularly clear way of articulating it, which helped me understand this stuff. I was also struck by my own participation writing the CPA's Good Equity Practices document, which talks about different types of inclusion, particularly the importance of inclusion of philosophy by or philosophy in the tradition of various people. And the call that, you know, I had made as an author of this document, that we need to diversify our course content, the feeling of hypocrisy, right? Teaching only European ethical theory while talking about the importance of diversifying course content weighed on me. And then reading Jay Garfield and Brian Van Noorden's piece in the New York Times, where they basically call out North American philosophy for its Eurocentrism, and they say if all you're teaching in your philosophy programs is European or American philosophy, stop calling your departments philosophy departments. It's not. It's just a misrepresentation. And, you know, Sundar Sarkai has made very similar arguments, as has Arun Bala when talking about the sciences. It's the same kind of issue. And my conversations with Jobin Kanjirakat as well very much informed the urgency where I just felt I could not teach these Eurocentric primers anymore. I just wasn't going to do it. I can't face it. The problem is that presenting ethical theory as if all of it that's worth knowing comes from Europe and culture shaped by Europeans is white supremacist. I don't see how we can avoid this. Even if we don't explicitly teach white supremacy, we model it, teaching it through example when we behave as if European philosophy is all a competent philosopher has to know, or all that is needed to solve real-world ethical problems. And so this is sort of the point I came to. And of course, it's particularly acute in applied ethics context and in a multicultural society like Canada, where we hope that philosophy will inform and persuade public policy, which is made by diverse policymakers and for a diverse population. How to go about creating the primer really struck me when I was put in the position of giving a ethics lecture at the Dalhousie University's Faculty of Architecture and Planning's Ethics Week, right? So for their, I think it's a 3-year program, they have 1 week where they explicitly address ethics, and almost all of that is, sort of about architects who do sustainable architecture or green architecture or social justice architecture. They don't actually get any theory at all. So I thought, well, how can I teach ethics in 90 minutes? What do you do to teach ethics in 90 minutes? And it came to me that you really need the basic ways of thinking about what counts ethically, the basic lenses that Clarisse is going to talk about in a couple of minutes. And I have been very much informed by Sue Sherwin's account of ethical lenses. And I'll just read this terrific quotation from her. She says, "Since each of the major theoretical perspectives helps to ensure that applied ethicists discuss important moral questions that usually go unaddressed by those who use other theoretical approaches, and none exhaust all moral questions, we need a metaphor that helps us to combine as well as to shift perspectives. I recommend that we think of the competing theoretical options as a set of lenses available for helping to understand the complex moral dimensions of applied ethics. Lenses are readily switched when we want a different view of something, and they may even be layered on top of one another. I carry 3 different sets of eyeglasses with me so that I can see things at a distance, read fine print, and function in bright sunlight or at night. Some lenses will provide clearer perceptions of particular problems than others, but we may still gain understanding by trying on different options. As for example, we can benefit by studying a tree through both binoculars and a microscope. Which instrument provides the right view will depend on our aims and needs at the time. This does not mean that all approaches are equally valid, nor that all proposed solutions are morally acceptable. It is just that we cannot always predict in advance which formulations are going to be the most morally instructive. Okay, I will now hand it over to Clarisse.
Awesome. So thanks, Letitia. I'm going to talk about a little bit of an overview of the primer, so sort of how we've structured the text. But more specifically, I'm going to dig deeper into section 3 and 4, which are our focus on the ethical lenses, and then a couple of important ethical concepts that don't fit neatly within the lens framework that we propose. So section 1 is essentially just a brief introduction to ethics. We talk about the difficulties of using emotions, attitudes, and social conventions in moral deliberation, why theories are important to us in helping reflect on these sorts of difficulties. We also introduce the lens approach that Letitia has just explained with Sue Sherwin's quote, where we try to encourage students to use the theories to focus on various aspects of ethical decision-making, and how considering a variety of lenses can also confirm some of our ethical deliberations, especially if these theories agree on the best action. In section 2, we provide a brief introduction to philosophy and the philosophical method. So we discuss things like what an argument is and how do we evaluate one. But notably, in our primer specifically, we've added a discussion about engaging in productive philosophical debates. We really wanted to encourage students to enter into productive and respectful dialectics with each other. So we include things like the idea of argument repair, or the process of helping an interlocutor improve their argument, as opposed to advocating for an aggressive and adversarial debate style, where each party, of course, is more intent on winning, as opposed to developing and improving one's argument. And we both think that this helps to reinforce the lens approach to ethics, because it's less about which theory is the best or which choice is the best, but more about appreciating what each lens can offer when we consider different approaches to the problem. And then in our public reasons chapter, we also try to draw out some of the flaws of following conventions when making ethical decisions. So this is where we briefly mention the attractiveness for making objective moral standards as opposed to relativist ones. All to say that the lenses can help us evaluate the fairness, justice, and consistency of conventions, whether we have really good reasons for our emotional reactions or following conventional norms. And then in section 5, which Letitia will come back to a little bit towards the end, we discuss self-regarding attitudes, moral licensing, and how cognitive biases can impair ethical decision-making. So aside from encouraging students to return to the moral ethical lenses to make good choices, we also have a discussion about using helpful heuristics and how to mitigate some of these cognitive biases. Awesome, so moving on to a deeper discussion about the ethical lenses. We start the primer by talking about consequentialism. So in addition to the standard act and rule utilitarian theories, we've included moism. Written consequentialist theories go back to the work of Mozi, which were prominent during the Warring States era in China. This was a time of political chaos that brought political misery and hardship to ordinary people. Mozi thought that the underlying cause of this misery was people's partiality and strong sense of filial piety. So there are many interesting similarities between Moism and European utilitarian theories. And of course, this is notably the idea that we're better off by encouraging impartiality. And although these two theories value different ends and how to achieve them, Moism and utilitarianism both believe that our decisions should consider the consequences of our actions and society as a whole. Just as a side note, we've broken utilitarianism into both act and rule utilitarianism. So here we strive not only to show a diversity of theories or concepts in the primer, as Letitia says, but we also want to include a diverse and inclusive list of sources for suggested readings. So we're in the process of compiling some of these readings for our chapters. And one of the challenges I've had is finding diverse authors to include in the consequentialist section. So at the end, I would really appreciate any sort of suggestions you might have. Okay, in the deontology section, or the deontology lens, unlike consequentialism, where we were able to find a non-European consequentialist theory, our chapters on deontology and virtue ethics take a little bit of a different approach. So in this chapter, we actually discuss the Gita, one of the holy scriptures for Hinduism. While the Gita covers a broad range of ethical dilemmas and spiritual topics from various lenses, we specifically discuss one aspect of Arjuna's moral dilemma to demonstrate another way to understand and use a deontological lens. We wanted to encourage students to enter, oh, sorry, accidentally hit a key. So specifically, there are scriptures that cover Arjuna's moral dilemma to fight as a warrior for justice in the war against his cousins, which of course is in tension with his duty to his family by not killing his kin. So although the Gita itself doesn't fit neatly into any particular ethical theory, we're using the specific dialogue from it to develop a deeper understanding of using a deontological lens. So instead of focusing our chapters on European theories and taking this theory-driven approach to ethical issues, we're considering using these lenses by looking at, number one, the consequences of our actions, two, the intention of our actions and duties, the virtue or character, of our character or actions, or salient relations to help us consider these ethical problems. So in this section, how can various theories and canons, such as W.D. Ross's list of duties and Kant's deontological approach, as well as the Gita, help us evaluate a moral situation using various duties and understandings about duties. In our chapter on virtue ethics, in addition to Aristotelian theory, we draw on Buddhist ethics to consider vices and virtues. Again, although Buddhism is a broad spiritual canon that involves a range of teachings that could fall under any of the ethical theories, many scholars tend to characterize it in ways that make it understandable through both consequentialist and virtue ethics lenses. So the aim of Buddhism is to live so as to minimize suffering, because suffering is believed to be an inescapable part of life. However, Buddhist teachings suggest a virtue approach in order to achieve these ends to minimize suffering. So suffering is believed to stem from greed, ignorance, and hatred that arises because we have a craving to avoid life's difficulties. And in Buddhism, these are called the root evils or poisons, essentially 3 vices. However, Buddhist teachings state that we can end this suffering by responding differently to the poisons. in order to bring nirvana or awakening and compassion for all beings. And we can achieve this through the eightfold path, which are essentially 8 virtues that we should cultivate in order to avoid this suffering. So even in contemporary virtue ethics, there are many accounts of what virtues one ought to cultivate and which vices one should avoid, as Hursthouse calls them, the V rules. So although Buddhism is much more than an ethical theory, we've included it in the primer because it can offer a non-European account of virtues and vices for us. So in our chapter on relational ethics, we've incorporated a diversity of theories and concepts that consider the way that different kinds of relationships could be considered in the ethical decision-making process. So to help us highlight the importance of personal relationships in ethical decision-making, we've discussed feminist care ethics, which of course considers caring, dependent relationships that aren't often captured by the main ethical theories, and Confucian ethics, or ideas from the Kongfuzi, which emphasize that we learn moral emotions through our relationships with our parents. In the next section, we discuss feminist theories and concepts that focus on patriarchal injustice, such as intersectionality, oppression, and nothing without us. I'm sure most of us are familiar with these, so I'm just going to move on to the next one. Letitia and I have also included the South African concept of Ubuntu, which focuses on collectivism while rejecting individualism. Ubuntu was an important concept in reshaping human rights discussions after apartheid. And although Ubuntu isn't easily translated into English, African scholars explain it as a harmony of the community. So the well-being and the survival of anyone in a community is intimately connected with the well-being and survival of everyone in the community. So from such a perspective, simply pursuing one's own self-interest while neglecting or harming others of the community is in effect also harming oneself. And in the last section, we introduce a concept that is central to the worldview of many indigenous peoples in what settlers call North America. The All My Relations teaching emphasizes interdependence and respect between human and non-human beings. Non-human beings have moral status and don't exist solely to serve humans. So harmony of humans and all other beings in the environment is at the priority of this teaching. And this concept is closely connected to the 7 generations teaching. When thinking about how one should act, this teaching recommends that we consider the actions and traditions of the previous 7 generations and how the effect of our actions would affect the next 7 generations. So this foundational principle explains that our choices, actions, and mistakes have this ripple effect throughout history. Ideally, we spend time in every role or generation. So it's not only forward-looking as how will our actions impact the future, but there's also a strong tie and importance to previous generations, histories, and cultural origins. So in the ethical lenses section, we've identified 4 main patterns or approaches to considering ethical issues. And our primer is designed to try to focus on each of these lenses and how different theories and concepts can reflect the lens. Lenses are, of course, exemplified by some of these specific theories or traditions or scriptures. However, the lenses aren't exhaustive, and we found that some ethical concepts don't fit neatly into any of these 4 categories. So we've included a section that we've called Beyond the Ethical Lenses. So in this section, I think the best way to characterize it is we have one approach to ethics where all of the lenses might actually come into play equally within the concept. And in the case of rights theory, these ethical lenses have become somewhat detached from the original theories and have been kind of embraced in the global discourse as standalone concepts. So ahimsa, or nonviolence, is an important moral principle in South Asian traditions of Jainism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and as some would say, Sikhism. Because all beings desire happiness and to avoid suffering, ahimsa states that no living being should be hurt or killed. While many might think this simply means non-interference, contemporary scholars and historical activists in the pacifist tradition argue that ahimsa is not passive, but could even offer itself a comprehensive normative ethical framework. And what's interesting about ahimsa is that it draws on all of the four lenses equally. It is consequentialist in the sense that it wants to promote happiness and minimize suffering. It's deontological in that our motivations behind our actions must also align with nonviolence. We must intend peace and compassion and not just simply act as if we do. It teaches the cultivation of virtues that allow one to be harmonious with oneself and society. And lastly, it is relational in that it draws attention to how beings are interconnected with each other and vulnerable to harm from each other. So any violence towards one being results in the violence towards oneself. So, of course, rights discourse has become politically and socially powerful. So we've decided to include a discussion on rights and privileges because most students are familiar with this language. But as we've seen in many recent political movements related to the pandemic and vaccine mandates, many people have misconceptions about what it means to have rights and privileges. So in our chapter on rights, we want to clarify important distinctions between the kinds of rights that one might have, while highlighting important tensions if one were to only use a rights approach to ethics. So we use this opportunity to make the distinction, of course, between legal and moral rights, reinforcing some of our earlier discussions about public reasons and conventions. Just because something is legal doesn't mean that we should uncritically accept that it is also unethical. We also highlight the tension between negative and positive rights, specifically which rights are more deserving of protection when these rights conflict, and how rights actually bear certain duties on others to protect or provide given rights. So these debates usually require one to return to the original theories that were used to ground the rights in the first place. So we really try to use this section on rights to clarify important social and political language to students, while hopefully at the same time correcting common misconceptions about rights language, and also encouraging students to use this lens approach to consider issues and not just default to using a theory of rights when evaluating an ethical dilemma. And I'll pass it back to Letitia to finish off.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why we maintain a lot of the European theory in the primer is because so much contemporary policy is actually shaped by these theories. And so, the Tri-Council policy statement, which of course is Canada's version of the Belmont Report for any US folks who are with us, kind of exemplifies this, but I think it's true for any policy documents you're going to find out there in applied ethics contexts, any sort of codes of conduct and things like that. So in the Tri-Council policy statement, which, I'm not dissing it at all, but it's got very clearly a very explicitly articulated set of moral guidelines. They explicitly say respect for persons, concern for welfare, and justice are the key theoretical orientations or commitments that shape the document. Of course, respect for persons is basically Kantian deontology. Concern for welfare pretty much is utilitarianism, certainly the way they treat it. And justice in the Tri-Council policy statement typically seems to be referring to the kinds of equity and fairness considerations that are characteristic of feminist discussions. And so there's a real concern with oppression, for instance, and how to navigate that. You also have, and this is very interesting to me, the chapter 9, which is such a weird chapter because it fits so poorly with the rest of the TCPS. So that's the chapter which addresses research involving First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. And it has a much more collectivist deal. It focuses on the importance of community engagement. It addresses issues about the relationship of Indigenous folks with the land. And the recommendations in that chapter actually poorly fit the basic principles that the TCPS starts out with. And so I kind of see that as a sign that we need something more like the primer to make sense of where policies is going and should go. Another kind of advantage of the primer is the redirection of current issues from a rights discourse to a more substantive one. So, you know, I'm sure everyone has watched with various degrees of horror just the paucity of the rights discourse around the so-called freedom convoy. I have a friend who calls them honkies, but I probably shouldn't say that in company. But anyway, the you know, the point being that it's very clear that the motivations of this movement, many of them are rooted in a poor understanding of rights and the nature of competing rights, and the way that you know, a positive right to do something must be constrained by other people's security rights to be free from getting a horrible disease. And I think the previous paper talking about vulnerability really helps to bring some of those issues into the fore. You don't have to have a lot of rights discourse to help you to start seeing that. And so in the primer, what we've tried to do is include rights, but then show how when we start talking about competing rights, and you invariably do if you're talking about rights, then you really need to start leaning on some of the other lenses. We also talk explicitly about self-regarding attitudes, as that seems like a real issue nowadays, how things like selfishness or rational self-interest is actually going to lead you to something more like a social contract way of thinking, a place where everyone simply pursues their own self-interest in a non-reflective way, leads to, you know, a world where life is nasty, brutish, and short, or the Warring States period that Mozart was influenced by. And we also talk about exceptionalism and moral licensing, partly because they seem like urgent problems in our society at the moment. Okay, so that's an overview of the primer. What we're planning to do this summer is fix some of the formatting issues and polish the text. We also really want to add suggested readings that address the lenses and the sources that we employ to help students and professors dig deeper. So, you know, the chapters are tiny. They're really 1 or 2 pages usually. And we know that it is quick and dirty. What we really would like the primer to be is something that's a first step into finding out more. And so we really want to make sure we have good sources, not just for the usual European suspects, but also for the non-European thinkers and theories. We're also thinking of bringing in more of a discussion of moral perception. It's currently tacit in the lens approach, and we may need to make that a bit more explicit. And then we're thinking of maybe expanding the discussion of intersectionality and maybe talking a bit about reflective equilibrium and the helpful heuristics. There's a set of possibilities. Maybe we'll add some pedagogical tools like quizzes and text boxes. And of course, what we're really hoping to do is address criticisms and integrate suggestions from students and from colleagues like you. So, you know, please, if you have any suggestions, send them to us before the end of April. Now, the key consideration for me is that we need to make sure that the text stays short enough and clear enough to do its job. And this, I've somewhat arbitrarily decided, means it's got to be 25,000 words or less. Okay, the last thing I want to do is just talk about a few objections. So you might reasonably say, look, you can't possibly teach all of Asian, indigenous to North America or Turtle Island, and African ethics properly in one introductory applied ethics course. Well, yes, that's true, but you can't teach any of the European ethical traditions or theories properly in one introductory applied ethics course either. All of the introductory texts that I've looked at in the primers, they're all just a quick and dirty overview of the key ideas. You can't even represent all of the different ethical theories at all. But what you can do is you can give students a taste of the basic ideas and some facility with applying the lenses to ethics cases. And that's what we're trying to do, and sort of showing how the theory inhabits, as it were, the lens, right? The theory shows you the content of the lens and helps to show you how to apply it. Another kind of objection you might have is that the approach still follows the basic model of European ethics: consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics, and relational ethics. And because it does that, it's still Euro-centric and white supremacist. So yeah, maybe that's right. I hope not. I think Clarisse hopes not. But of course, we still have this challenge of making sure that our applied ethics courses still do the job of helping students understand contemporary policy, which is itself shaped by European ethics. So there's got to be some kind of conformity of any useful primer with European ethics, because otherwise you're not going to be able to use it to understand policy. And I think that's one of the very important parts of applied ethics courses, particularly for students who, like most of the students in our applied ethics course, are going to take this one philosophy course and will never take another ethics course again. Giving them something that helps to make intelligible the codes of conduct that they're going to be navigating in their professional careers, I think really matters. Anyway, if it does, then please write one yourself that doesn't, and send it to me quickly, because I want to use it, or at least tell us how we can do better. And that's all we have to say. Thank you so much. Again, please send us any suggestions you might have. We've made use of some of the folks who are listed here who have already kindly given us feedback, but we are happy to get more.
All right, thanks so much for that talk. I think there will be some suggestions showing up in the chat, but also Sandra, if you'd like to start our Q&A.
Okay, thank you. That was amazing. One of the things that occurred to me is that this primer is something which no philosophy department should allow their instructors to teach applied ethics without having very carefully studied this primer. In other words, it is an educational tool for instructors in applied ethics, because one of the things that I find so frustrating as someone who really made a life out of doing applied ethics, it is marginalized in philosophy, and one of the ways in which it is marginalized is really illustrated by what you said at the end of your talk. You get one semester and you are supposed to do a course in moral theory and applied ethics. Quite frankly, I say garbage to that. And I always would tell my students, this is like taking a course in applied physics without doing physics. And so if you feel disadvantaged, you are. And the system is disadvantaging you. One of the ways perhaps to thwart what philosophy departments do to applied ethics teachers might be actually to say, well, you know, I'm not going to teach theory. I am going to teach values and principles. And everyone who comes into the class will be bringing them. And we're going to look at these problems. We're going to look at injustices and dilemmas, and we're just going to talk in terms of what we bring to it. We're going to use our intuitions, our imaginations, our feelings, and our thinkings. And actually, I should say right off the bat, a whole lot of what I just said right now comes right from Bruce Morito's Thinking Ecologically. The idea that you use all of yourself to figure out what you should do. And I don't know that any Western philosophy theory is going to tell you that, because what they're going to tell you is that you think a lot. They're not going to talk to you much about deontological experiences and the like. But I really hope that your primer gets used, because you're so right. Western philosophers are in classrooms with diversity that we are ignoring. And we don't even give them room in our classrooms where they can see the ideas, the lens that they're looking through. And I think your primer, sorry, it will really do that. So I think you are doing a great service to applied philosophy. But if I was still teaching at university, I would use this book in my moral theory class. You give them this book and you guys go out and read whoever you want and write your essays or do whatever. But this is a wonderful place, I think, to, and there you get a whole year. At least we did at the University of Winnipeg. Moral theory course gets a whole year. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That's such a kind thing to say. Thanks. I'm not sure if there's much else to say to that, but yeah, that I think, well, that would be great.
Yes, hello, thank you. I think this is wonderful. I have one possible suggestion for a consequentialist theory. It is from the Western world, but it doesn't come out of the Western philosophy tradition. It comes out of computer science, which has this idea of the utility function. So the computers have to maximize their utility function, and there's a lot of mostly independent from philosophy discussion about how you would make an ethical theory that a computer would try and maximize. The front runner there is coherent extrapolated volition, which is a really weird thing, but it might maybe be worth talking about. It might not be the sort of, it's outside of what's traditionally considered in the Western philosophy canon. So that's why I bring it up.
Yeah. Can I just respond to that quickly?
Oh, yes, of course.
So my concern with that is I think that comes out of utilitarianism, right? You have really a kind of long tradition, it's good 200 years old. And of course, you know, you've got the rational decision theory, which is, again, coming out of that tradition and taking a similar kind of approach. Now, what I would say is if someone was using this primer in a computer ethics class, that would be fantastic to add to it, because you then make the sort of the idea of consequentialism relevant to the software and the practice of the folks in the class, right? So as it stands, the primer is written in a way that you could use it in any applied ethics classes. It doesn't have a bioethics spin. It doesn't have I mean, I teach ethics and science, but, you know, computer ethics, environment, there's all kinds of different ethics.
So
yeah.
Funny that you should mention that.
Yeah.
I'm actually in a project right now where we're trying to build a computer-mediated communication device where the idea is to try and make more happiness within online discourse, which if you think about it is like what counts as happiness, how do you determine that? Happiness as a thing seems to be like embedded in various different forms of ethical systems. We're having a whole issue with trying to get the philosophical underpinnings of this project at all comprehensible. And what we've decided to rest on is the idea of the moral parliament, which has a bunch of different ethical systems, each trying to have their say within any sort of disagreements or ways of looking at it. So I'm actually probably going to use this primer as here's our inventory of philosophical traditions that will have seats in the parliament. So
cool. So, I mean, I would just say, look, there's a whole lot more than just what's here, right? And so
it's a starting place. And
yeah, it's a starting place, but there's, you know, it's a mere starting place. But the other thing I would say is, boy, I think Buddhism is going to be really helpful for you, because the root evils, you know, the root evils are things that produce suffering. And even if it, you know, and that actually might be a useful reframing. It's not so much as pursuing happiness, very Aristotelian idea. It's more avoiding suffering.
So the previous programs coming out of the lab have all been exactly that. It's like, how do you ameliorate the suffering? And the primary researcher has been kind of like burnt out on that. And they want to, instead of trying to reduce suffering, they want to try and build the good, build happiness. And like that's just the personal preference of that person who happens to be leading the lab. So that's what we're focusing on for the moment.
Can I just ask, is it ameliorating suffering, or is it not producing suffering? Because
it's, to be quite honest, it's not really either. It's simply identifying harms, and so that gives the user of the computer mediated communication system the opportunity to make their own decisions about it. Specifically, it was things like fake news and other things like that, which were detected so that people could choose not to interact with that if they so chose. That was the old program.
Interesting. Cool.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? That was really great. I'm actually going to get in line to buy that book when it comes out.
So it's online. It's an open educational resource.
Wonderful.
So it's there should be a link in the chat to it, so you can get it now. Now we're going to do a rewrite this summer, so you know it's in pretty good shape. I'm not embarrassed of what it is at the moment, but you know there's some things where I'm like, yeah, it's not quite where we want it to be, but it's fine as it is.
I had one suggestion, and if it's already in there somehow, just tell me it's in there. And this is from very sort of self-interested background, but do you have a section on something called narrative ethics or narrative bioethics?
No, so we certainly would. I mean, again, it's a general primer, so we don't emphasize bioethics or anything like that.
Just narrative ethics. I mean, just a way to sort of.
So here's what we do.
Okay.
We don't have a section on, and this is one of the things that I would actually like to extend. We don't have a section on narrative ethics, but it is kind of included in the virtue ethics, because you know certainly for a number of traditions, right, and even Aristotle has this idea of you know who is the virtuous person, and telling the sort of stories of virtue, I think you're quite right. That's very powerful, and so that's where I would like to include it, is the narrative there, because I think you're right. It would be nice to include it. It's just finding the right narrative and the right tradition for it to come from.
Oh,
so
of course.
yeah, I've been thinking about you know there's certain narratives in Confucius. And of course, Confucius himself is this sort of, you know, the sage. He's the sage, or at least one of them. And so that whole tradition is very much based on storytelling as well. But yeah, I agree. It's nice to have it there, and it's currently, we talk about it, but we don't show it.
And one way to show it is maybe like in your suggested readings to include something like I use books like Never Let Me Go or The Incident of the Dog in what is it called? I always forget the name. The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. Basically books that you're suggesting as a way to approach philosophy without reading actual philosophical texts. Anyway, okay, thank you. Thank you.
If I could maybe ask you guys to return to the tension that I think was the last objection that you considered. So this project sounds great. I'm excited. Integrating everything sounds great. I did worry, I had both of the objections. The worry that, look, this just seems to say that the big frameworks are these ones that, you know, it's Kant versus Mill again, and Aristotle. And but then I sort of saw a connection between that and your comment, you've got two projects. We want to challenge white supremacy in sort of the theoretical framings, and maybe we want to challenge white supremacy in particular policy projects. And given that policy dialogue is often in those Western framings, we can't abandon the Western framings. So I just thought, oh, those are both great projects. And
So
go ahead. No, go ahead.
So just, I mean, it's not so much challenging it, for me at least, it's just not actively participating in it.
Right.
I just don't want to do it anymore.
Right.
That's what I got to. I mean, I had to have these conversations with Jobin or with Sundar, and they'd just be like, I mean, they're talking about philosophy of science, but it's the same thing. You are teaching this as
Right.
if all that happens is in Europe. And, when I myself had recognized, I mean, it's obvious that, Confucianism is relational, crucially, right? I mean, there are problematic relationships, but, Kant had all kinds of problematic ideas as well. So God knows Aristotle did. So we don't sort of use the horrible aspects, the sexism of Aristotle as a reason not to teach him. And so I'm not going to use the sexism of Confucius not to teach him. But what I find striking again is the continuities. So I mean, I think there's it's not like European ethics is bad and should be rejected. I'm not saying that. It's more that there's not just that, and there's useful stuff that is in some ways better in other places. And even if it's not better, sometimes it was first. And we have this obsession of, well, who said it first? And then we just ignore it when it's non-Western folks. And that's just objectionable. So, it's why we start with Mozart, because he is, so far as I know, the first clearly consequentialist author in the history of philosophy, and yeah, he gets ahead of Bentham by 2,000 years. Well, maybe not quite so, 1,500, I don't know. But how do we miss him? So it's more for me, not so much challenging white supremacy, is not engaging it in it anymore, or at least what by my own standards counts.
So I guess then that makes sense. I'm not an expert. I was very taken by the Garfield book that I put into the comments. And one of the things that Garfield does in that book, he goes through what can Buddhism offer to contemporary Western, epistemologists? What can Buddhism offer to contemporary? And time and again, he's like, look, these issues that Western, metaphysicians have worried about, they come up almost the same in Buddhism. And then you hit the ethics chapter and he says, stop. Here, Buddhism does not match on to any of the frameworks. So he, makes a case against Buddhism as virtue ethics, a case Buddhism as consequentialist. And so thinking about, and I'm not an expert, so all I can, claim is I read Garfield and he impressed me. So I thought, there does seem to be a tension. I don't have any thoughts about this, but there seems to be a tension between, we want this class to be useful for you to engage in, say, critiquing some political project that's live. And we want you to see that, so on the one hand, that, on the other hand, ethics is not just this Western project. And a little bit of the, like, you know, people often critique applied ethics textbooks for saying, you know, there's Kant. And then if you want, you know, women or anyone other than Kant and dead white men from Europe, they're going to be applied at the end. And you get sort of that if you say they're the frameworks of Kant and Mill and Aristotle. And we're going to take the non-Westerns and show you how they, and Garfield's resisting that, right? By saying, no, don't think Buddhism. Anyway, that's a tension that you highlighted. I just have no idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say, so I think, you know, there are different ways to read these theories, just as there are different ways to read the, you know, even, you know, the dead white guys. We still disagree on what Kant really is. So, you know, there's that. Now, what we try to do is, you know, the lenses are primary, and they're really just the thought of, you can worry about the consequences, you can worry about the action itself and the intention behind it, you can worry about what kind of person do you want to be, and you can worry about the relationships that you're in. And so those are just the basic kinds of considerations you can have. And I think that, you know, when you drill down in something like Buddhism, you know, it's complicated, and there's a whole metaphysics behind it, for crying out loud, as there is for all of them. There's metaphysics behind Mill, there's metaphysics behind Kant, there's, you know, they all have, God knows, Confucius, or at least a later Confucian. So the lenses are primary, and then the theories are just ways of getting a grip on them. So that's more the approach in the text. And it's a bit, I'm not sure we've quite massaged it enough to say that. So we're still working on it. And I'm thinking of, you know, maybe rather than consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics, just calling the chapters a focus on consequences, a focus on action, a focus on character. And so it's more decentering the Eurocentrism.
That's really great. Thanks. I think we have time for one more question. Natalie.
Hi, thank you. So I do look forward to using and reading the reader. And I also appreciate you kind of clarifying your stance in regards to challenging, I guess, kind of the supremacy of like European philosophy. And I wanted to ask you specifically about your definition of like Eurocentrism, because while I do appreciate the move to integrate and to center other philosophers, I kind of realize that like some, if I'm thinking like specifically Caribbean scholars, like don't have the luxury of having evolved and written in a space that was not influenced by Europe. And in my own dissertation work, I use Fanon, Frantz Fanon's work. And then when I think about it, like I really thank you for helping me question this, because I'm like, oh, he was from Martinique. He studied medicine in France. He, worked as a colonial psychiatrist, like in Algeria. So in a sense, I'm like, am I perpetuating Eurocentrism by trying to center Fanon, who's been like completely absent from like bioethics, and just wanted to, perhaps point to as well some of the work of the Caribbean Philosophical Association and like their series about creolizing the canon. And of course, like I'm completely attuned and receptive to your project, but just to maybe problematize it a bit as well.
Yeah, I think that's, I'm going to just agree with all of that. I mean, I think, and this was something that when I was working on the CPA Good Equity Practices document, thinking about different ways to be inclusive matters, right? It's not just sort of including philosophy in the tradition of, but it's also including philosophy by. And I mean, I think Caribbean philosophers have kind of a new tradition, in part because the philosophy by has made a sufficient difference in that colonial context. so, you know, I agree. I mean, I think when we're trying to articulate what Eurocentrism is, what white supremacy is, you know, that it's easy to get the obvious stuff, but it's hard to see how it all threads in. And it's even harder to figure out what it is to move beyond it, recognizing that, of course, the European tradition is going to always be part of the global tradition. It just needs to, you know, be woven into the rest of it rather better than it has been. But I think your point is well taken. I mean, you know, it's again, it's a very superficial introduction, and the complexities of something like Caribbean philosophy isn't something. I mean, I will say we mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. Yay, as part of the Ahimsa chapter, because of course he was so influenced by Gandhi. But that's, you know, that's sort of a strategic link, recognizing that there's a huge untapped well. Yeah.
All right, and with that, I think we have reached the end of our webinar for today. If everyone could again thank our speakers for fantastic talks. And I encourage everyone to visit the Society's website, I have to make sure I get this right, csspe.ca, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thanks.